This lesson will be about classifying numbers. We've been working with numbers in the school system since the very early days when you're in kindergarten. So our objective, I can classify numbers. We're going to start with kind of working with what you learned early, and then what we're going to move into even later in this course. So first of all, the first number system that you worked with were called natural numbers. This is back in the days when you were just counting. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and it just keeps going. Now, when we got to a later grade, like maybe first or second grade, they started talking about what if you have nothing? What if you have, instead of counting what you can count on your fingers, what if you have nothing? Well, you added the number 0 in that, and those are called the whole numbers. And notice that the whole numbers include all the natural numbers. It includes 0 and then all the ones that we already included with the naturals. So once we built into those whole numbers, we then moved into what about if you go negative? What if you go in the opposite direction and take things away instead of adding things up? And so those are called integers. And once you started talking about that concept of negative numbers, like if you started with the negatives and just counted your way up, and then include the whole numbers, those are called integers. Okay, so new concept, negatives added in. Well, once we did that, then the next new concept you talked about was working with fractions. Ratios, a number over a number. That number system has the word ratio in it. It's called the rational numbers. So the key word there is ratio because you can write them as a fraction of an integer over an integer. So it's things like 2/3 or -7/5. But they can also be written as decimals, and if you can write them as decimals, those decimals will either repeat, like 0.35 repeating, where the 35 keeps repeating, or you have a decimal that ends, that terminates. So say 0.875 ends. These decimals can be written as the ratio of two integers, thus they're called rational numbers. Now, if we have numbers that can't be written as a decimal that either ends or repeats, or you can't write it as a fraction or a ratio of two integers, those numbers are called irrational numbers. So just meaning not rational. So examples of those are that we used very frequently, and we built into this into our number system. And in recent years, you started looking at, for instance, square roots, like square root of 29, which we can't figure that out. Now, if I did square root of 25, that is a rational number because that's equal to 5, and it can be written as just 5/1, which is the ratio of two integers, or 5.0, a decimal that terminates, that ends. But this one, when you write it as a decimal, that decimal goes on forever. You never can get to the end of it. That's called an irrational number. It never repeats and never terminates. Another common example that we used in geometry a lot last year, was the number pi. That as a decimal goes on forever and never repeats. So those two number systems, when you put them together, rationals and irrationals, those are called real numbers. You've been working with real numbers in one form or another since kindergarten and before, and you've built in learning about more types of real numbers, like adding 0, adding negatives, now talking about fractions, now talking about numbers that can't be written as a ratio of two integers, decimals that go on forever and never repeat. If you put the rational and the irrational numbers together, they form the real numbers. Later on in this course, we're going to introduce a whole new number system that we've never talked about before. So just to preview that, we're going to talk about what are called imaginary Imaginary numbers are when you look at these square roots and you no longer have a square root of 0 or a positive, but if you want to take the square root of a negative, let's say, for instance, -6. Square root of -6 is an imaginary number. We'll introduce new types of notation for that. And if you put the real numbers and the imaginary numbers together, you get what are called the complex numbers, which is a new topic that we will talk about later in this course in Algebra 2. So you should be able to classify numbers. For now, focus on the real numbers. These together, knowing if they're natural, whole numbers, integers, rationals, or irrationals, and real numbers. And then later on in this course, we'll also add to our classification imaginary number and complex numbers.